Good. We are vanishingly close to 9 o'clock and all seated and ready, so I suggest we commence. It's really, as the Society of Professional Economists are absolutely delighted to be pairing with the Institute for Government on this highly topical and very complex subject of measuring public sector productivity. You'll have seen we're looking at a range of dimensions, measurement challenges, plans to address that. I'm pleased to see the ONS have just put out their update on how they're doing that, the drivers of productivity, and also venturing into the area of actions to deal with it. And the speakers here, I'm delighted to say, are Stephen Aldridge, who's Chief Analyst at the Department for Levelling Up and Levelling Up Housing and Communities.
Brilliant.
Yes, the most recent acronym, who has a long history of interest in this subject, unsurprisingly, followed by Gemma Tetlow, who you will all know as the Chief Economist here at the Institute for Government. But Stephen will speak first. A little bit more background of Stephen. In addition to having been in his current job of Chief Analyst at DLUC for some years and its predecessors, he also spent a time at the Cabinet Office during COVID, which was an interesting time. He's also worked at the Treasury and at the old Department of Trade and Industry. And then, as you'll see in the summary, he has a number of illustrious extra roles, including at the British Academy Public Policy Committee and various others. So very well equipped to speak to us now.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Huge thanks to the Society of Professional Economists for organising this event, and to the Institute for Government for hosting us, and great that Gemma is also going to be speaking this morning. Public sector and public service productivity are, in my view, a surprisingly neglected area of both academic inquiry and public policy focus, though there are a few notable exceptions. So the economist Tony Atkinson produced a landmark report on public sector productivity in 2005, and Patrick Dunlevy at the London School of Economics has researched these issues for many years. More recently, the Institute for Government, through its really excellent Public Services Performance Tracker, and Bart van Ark at the Productivity Institute have made invaluable contributions. But in many ways, these feel like exceptions to the norm. There aren't many cross-cutting public sector or public service productivity research centres in British universities, at least so far as I'm aware, though there are centres of expertise in particular services, which are perhaps a bit more pervasive. In some respects, perhaps, it's not surprising this is a comparatively neglected area of research and analysis. Public sector and public service productivity raise tricky conceptual issues, are far from easy to measure, as you know, we'll discuss further in a moment, and the data we have is far from ideal, notwithstanding the first-rate efforts of the Office for National Statistics and others. But against that, you know, the public sector and public services account for about a quarter of national output, 2/5 of national spending. So how well or badly the public sector and public services use resources matters for productivity performance more generally. It particularly matters when economic growth is sluggish and not generating additional tax revenues to pay for greater public spending on public services, and the fiscal position is constrained as a result. So in these circumstances, improving public sector and public service outcomes will depend crucially on making better use of existing resources. The evidence is clear in any case that public service performance depends on a great deal more than input funding, including the right sort of leadership, governance and accountability, innovation, a focus on prevention and early intervention, the empowerment of communities and service users, data and evidence on what works and what does not. That's really important. The capabilities and skills of the workforce and much more. Consistent with this, the Chancellor said in last year's autumn statement that he wanted to increase public sector productivity growth by at least half a percent point a year to maintain and improve public services whilst reducing the overall size of the state. This followed his commission in June last year of a review led by the national statistician into how public service productivity can be measured more effectively, and that's expected to start delivering improved measures from the spring of this year, with a progress report published literally just this week. It was online yesterday. So this seminar is well timed. Seems to me there's a great opportunity for the economics profession more generally to feed into this work. It's also worth noting by way of introduction that there's some evidence at least from Italy, which is where I came across this paper, that there's an independence between public sector productivity and private sector productivity. In other words, a more productive public sector is a contributor to a more productive private sector, though there aren't many studies on that either. In these remarks, I'm going to say a bit about what we mean by public sector and public service productivity, what measures we have and their limitations, what those measures show, what we know about the main drivers of public sector and public service productivity, and what actions might be taken to promote public service productivity, crucially perhaps as part of a more broadly based public service change or public service reform agenda. So what is public sector and public service productivity? In a way, it's quite straightforward. It's the relationship between public sector or public service outcomes and outputs and the inputs needed to produce them. The far from simple challenge is developing robust measures of those outcomes and outputs, particularly for non-marketed activities. There's also a crucial distinction to make, in my view, between technical and allocative efficiency as components of public sector and public service productivity. So technical efficiency is about doing the things we do currently, either at less cost or getting more outputs from what we currently do at the same cost, or some combination of the two. Allocative efficiency is about finding wholly different ways of doing things to achieve desired outcomes at less or substantially less cost. Technical efficiency, if you like, is about doing things right. Allocative efficiency is about doing the right things. Crucial for unlocking transformational improvements in productivity performance. Certainly one thing I've learnt over the years as a civil servant is that the public sector and public services can be characterised by significant allocative inefficiencies. In the private sector, what Schumpeter described as the forces of creative destruction have historically been important in reallocating resources to alternative uses, driving up outcomes through time. There's a tendency for discussions about public sector and public service productivity to focus almost exclusively on technical efficiency. Technical efficiency is important, you don't want to waste public resources, but the greater prize may be offered by allocative efficiency. However, as I've already said, measuring public sector and public service productivity poses great challenges. We might struggle to obtain robust data on costs. We may struggle to turn cost and price data into volumes of inputs and outputs. It's hard to adjust outputs for quality, and even harder sometimes to attribute changes in outcomes to changes in outputs. But notwithstanding that, the Office for National Statistics produces a remarkable annual publication on public service productivity for the UK, inspired by the Atkinson report of 2005, with a review in hand at present aimed at further enhancing the data we have. In most countries, public sector output is measured by public sector inputs. In the UK, by contrast, around two-thirds of public service spending is measured by quality-adjusted outputs. Thus, in the case of healthcare output, the measure is an appropriately weighted combination of inpatient, outpatient and daycare episodes and outputs of general practitioner services, adjusted for survival rates and health gain, waiting times and surveys of patient experience. In the case of schools, the throughput of full-time equivalent students is adjusted for educational attainment at GCSE or equivalent grades. In the case of adult social care outputs are adjusted for changes in how well care needs are met using an adult social care survey. And there are similar sort of quality adjustments for public order and safety and children's social care. So by these means, improved measures of public service outputs and outcomes are obtained, and they can then be related to measures of the input for each service to derive public service productivity measures. Because of their relative size, what happens in health and education is the key driver of overall public service productivity. The methods used here, of course, raised numerous issues and questions, lots of scope for challenge, but I'd stress that the approach taken by the Office for National Statistics is probably amongst the most sophisticated in the world. What do the measures show? Well, based on the Office for National Statistics' latest experimental methods, total public service productivity growth averaged 0.2% a year between 1997 and 2019, with a range from minus 1.4% per annum for public order and safety to plus 0.9% for healthcare, with education, adult social care and children's social care close to zero. Historically, private sector productivity has grown faster than public service productivity, but over the period from 2010 to the COVID crisis, the reverse was true. Public service productivity increased by an average of 0.7% a year, a marked improvement over the previous decade. It appears, though one needs to be careful about drawing firm conclusions, that austerity did indeed stimulate some improvement in public service productivity. The data for 2020, much distorted by COVID, it should be stressed, and not comparable to previous years, show a significant decline in public service productivity of the order of over 15%. There was then a rebound in 2021 and 2022. Based on new experimental modelled nowcasts, the Office for National Statistics estimate public service productivity growth was around 0.3% lower in 2022 than pre-COVID levels. There are also some ad hoc analyses around. So, for example, a recent piece by the Institute for Fiscal Studies notes that the National Health Service has significantly higher funding and staffing levels, up around 15 to 20% compared to 2019, before the pandemic, yet is treating the same or fewer patients. And that's not obviously made good by improvements in the quality of service, such as reduced waiting times. One specific measurement gap is capital, in my view, how productively the public sector and public service assets are used and the productivity or otherwise of new capital investment in each public service. Do we get the returns, economic and social, we should? Whilst there are a few studies, such as Tony King and Ivor Crew's brilliant book, The Blunders of Our Governments, they're comparatively few and far between. In many ways, we don't know as much about the productivity of our capital spend as we might do. What about the drivers of all these trends? Well, above all, my conclusion is I don't think there's a magic bullet to improving public sector productivity. There are various potential drivers, most or all of which probably need to be acted on in combination to have a desired effect. The key ones include data to enable us better to understand economic and social problems, to target resources more efficiently, maybe using tools such as data or predictive analytics, and to benchmark performance more effectively and transparently. Innovation and the diffusion of innovation, that could include technological innovations around digital transformation or artificial intelligence. Policy and programme evaluation, so we know what works and can allocate resources to activities that make most difference, thus boosting efficiency and productivity, and we can obviously in parallel stop doing those things that don't work. Organisational models that facilitate and encourage more joined up and efficient approaches across departmental boundaries and between different tiers of government, a better balance between prevention, early intervention and the treatment of problems, and which open up public services to new entrants, better able to roll out more productive service innovations and challenge existing providers. Capability and capacity, including a workforce with the skills, adaptability, agility and ability to learn from failure and to drive the application of data, evidence of what works, technology and innovation. Empowered users who can co-produce outcomes for communities on the one hand, and to whom service users are genuinely accountable and responsive, perhaps through quasi-markets on the other. And then leaders and managers focused on outcomes who understand the drivers and have the incentives and entrepreneurial freedom to seize opportunities at pace. So a lot of potential drivers. I wouldn't claim to have a view on which are the most important, but I do think you need to act across the piece if you want to drive public service and public sector productivity improvement. Given this, what exactly could or should we be doing across government further to promote public sector and public service productivity? This is something on which the Chancellor is keen to gather ideas, and it would be great to get thoughts of people at this seminar. I think the promotion of public service productivity is something that needs to be approached with a broad frame and probably part of a more broadly based approach around public sector and public service improvement and reform. So that would cover wider issues such as the overall strategy, funding levels and multi-year funding, workforce strategy and more, all of which are discussed very thoroughly in the annual Institute for Government performance trackers. However, the fiscal position is going to constrain our ability to spend our way out of many of the challenges facing public services. So the things I'm about to go through focus much more on what I hope are practical yet soundly based actions that could improve public sector and public service productivity and thus outcomes. So I think I've got 8 different dimensions to go through to this. First one is, I think it's really important that we continue to ensure the rigorous, objective appraisal of all public spending decisions based on facts and evidence, including undertaking such appraisals early enough in the decision-making process so a decision can be reversed if that's what the appraisal suggests should be done. So that's going to require the building of a culture where it's not seen as a failure not to proceed with a programme or project if the appraisal doesn't stack up. Robust appraisal offers a good chance, a better chance, of more effective and thus more productive interventions and associated spending. Second, and perhaps linked to this, trialling or piloting interventions much more before we scale up or roll out to see if they work could make a big difference. Such trialling and piloting could help us be more confident in what spending initiatives will deliver, support longer-term planning and delivery, and thus support improved public sector and public service productivity. Consistent with this, I'm proud to say my own department has recently just launched a major test and learn initiative for homelessness interventions, which will trial a whole series of innovative ways of reducing homelessness from which we can select the most effectively for application in future. Third, devolution, decentralisation and the empowerment of communities and families all open up, at least in principle, the scope for greater accountability, more experimentation, the breaking down of policy and delivery silos, culture change including continuous improvement, and the ability, again at least in principle, better to tailor services to the needs of local people and local communities with consequent productivity benefits. And that could all happen with any given level of overall public spending. Fourth, there's something to do around more generally empowering leaders and managers across the public sector and public services to exploit opportunities offered by digital technologies and transformation. Such technologies offer the opportunity to reduce administrative and other costs on the one hand, and to develop wholly new services that better meet needs of users than existing provision and potentially at much less cost. Fifth, as I already mentioned, I think it's really important to invest in policy and programme evaluation to give us a comprehensive and robust evidence base on what works. The National Audit Office has regularly set out Whitehall's poor track record in this respect, but it is a challenge that's being addressed with some rigour by the Evaluation Task Force. And my own department has published and is taking forward an evaluation strategy that I'm proud to say covers key interventions across all our policy areas, scaling up interventions that work and stopping those that don't will or should improve public sector and public service productivity. 6, there's something about removing barriers to shifting resources to where economic and social returns are greatest, and which in the process would improve public sector and public service productivity. For example, shifting resources over time from treating problems to preventing them or intervening earlier, or as the Institute for Government has argued, towards targeted capital investments that will deliver longer-term productivity gains, offer huge potential benefits. For any given level of public spending, the evidence suggests we would get outcomes from our budgets over time if we invested more in prevention and early intervention. And there's good evidence of that, I would say, across a number of different policy areas, including health, criminal justice, helping those experiencing multiple disadvantage, support for families and parenting, homelessness and rough sleeping, and others. However, it's fair to say that making such a shift is quite hard to do. The NHS only spends 5% of its budget on prevention. So we need innovations that would make increased levels of preventative investment easier to achieve, including overcoming the double funding problem of maintaining treatment while shifting to prevention and early intervention. That might include exploring the scope for genuinely innovative social investment, partnerships with the private sector, or other approaches that would enable a shift of resources from the reactive treatment of problems to proactive prevention and early intervention. None of that is easy, but as I say, there's good evidence, including from my own department's work on supporting families and homelessness and rough sleeping, that this can significantly improve outcomes for any given level of spend, reducing the number of children going into care or people sleeping rough, and that for me represents a productivity improvement. 7th, making better use of data, as I say, to help us better understand the economic and social problems we're dealing with and their drivers, to help us target resources more effectively at tackling those drivers, including technologies and methods better able to predict who may need help, thus in turn again enabling us to intervene earlier and more cost effectively to head off problems. And then the same data can also help us better identify where and how performance can be improved. In relation to the last of these, my team has for some years analysed the technical efficiency of local government. For each local service for which local government is responsible, we seek to calculate the unit cost of delivering that service with an adjustment made for differences in area costs such as labour or office accommodation. And we then use tools such as the Chartered Institute for Public Finance and Accountancy's nearest statistical neighbours model to compare authorities with other authorities like each other in terms of population characteristics and service outcomes achieved. And that begins to give you estimates of the potential scope for technical improvements in local government if, say, all local authorities performed at the median level for their statistical neighbours. The newly established Office for Local Government provides a great opportunity, I would argue, to gather such data and take forward more such analysis. Indeed, it could be a model on which other services could also build. The potential improvements identified by such work, it should be stressed, relate solely to technical efficiency, what theoretically could be realised if all local authorities did what they do now at the median or some other level of efficiency. So they don't capture potential improvements in allocative efficiency if, say, local authorities adopted different ways of achieving desired outcomes. But such comparisons of the productivity of different service providers within a given service could in principle be extended to other public services to help drive improved productivity performance across the piece. And then eighth and finally, you'll be glad to know, there's something about taking continuing action to remove barriers to joined up solutions across Whitehall and between central and local government, which could more effectively, for example, meet the needs of vulnerable people. My department has recently commissioned a homelessness systems evaluation, and maybe that provides a pointer to the opportunities that could be realised through systems approaches that mobilise different departments, bring together central and local government more efficiently and effectively to achieve desired outcomes. So my department can't on its own end homelessness and rough sleeping, but it needs the Ministry of Justice and the Prison Service, the Department for Health and Social Care, including drug and alcohol abuse services, the Department for Work and Pension, others, to play their part. We will be more effective and more productive if we work together. Of course, this is a perennial aspiration, but no less true for that. The need to think and act systemically pervades, of course, many public services. Health and social care is another compelling example. The report issued by Public First and the Institute for Government last summer on the NHS productivity puzzle pointed to various key drivers of NHS productivity at present, including undertaking the right capital investment, avoiding high levels of staff turnover, effective hospital management empowered to drive efficient and effective outcomes, minimising delayed discharges, and the right incentives, amongst others. The important thing about all this is that these things need to be delivered in combination. Maybe that's a theme of all my remarks here. Any one is not enough. A strategic and system-wide approach is key. There are no doubt other reforms and actions that could be added to this list I've just gone through, but I think these are the main ones. It would be great to hear the views of people here on what their priorities are for improving public service productivity. What have I missed? What have I got wrong? And is what I've reviewed today totally fanciful? Anyway, I'll stop there and give Gemma a chance to contribute to.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. You started with the theory, you moved on to the data, and then your fascinating depiction of what could be done and how challenging it is.
Indeed.
We have a wonderful range of people in the audience here, so I look forward very much to ongoing discussion about these issues. But before we do that, it makes sense to hear Gemma talk from her perspective. Gemma has been chief economist here in the IFG for some years now.
Yeah, nearly 6 years.
But before that was a journalist, and before that cut her teeth for some time at the Institute of Fiscal Studies, where she worked on public sector.
Public finances. So great to have you here, particularly given your role in the very excellent tracker, which we all need to keep a close eye on. So it will be good to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you, Stephen, for those really excellent opening remarks. I thought I'd just add a few things and show you a few charts and try not to repeat too much points that Stephen has already covered. But just wanted to start by kind of reiterating the point that Stephen started on about why this really matters and is really important. Stephen set out lots of reasons. I guess I'd add one further thing to the mix, which Stephen touched on somewhat, which is that we face growing demands, particularly on healthcare and other services for our ageing population. This isn't a new thing. We've had, since the Second World War, we've devoted a growing share of GDP to spending on healthcare in particular. But in previous decades, we've managed to do this by cutting back on things like defence spending and debt interest payments. Looking forward, that's not going to be possible again. And so we really need to make sure that we're spending the money we do on these services as well as we possibly can, because it's going to be very hard, particularly with a slow-growing economy, to find the resources needed to provide the services that people really want. And so doing this productively really matters. I just thought I'd start with the point that Stephen already mentioned, which is sort of a more recent puzzle, which I think
increases the importance of understanding what's going on with public service productivity, which is what's happened to NHS productivity since the pandemic. This is just an updated version of some charts that were presented in the report we published last summer on NHS productivity. On the left-hand side, this is showing the percentage increase in different categories of staff between 2019 and 2023. So you can see really large increases in staffing numbers in the NHS of both management staff and frontline care staff. But over that same period, there's some small reduction in staff effort because there's been some increase in sickness among staff, but it's not making a big difference to the overall picture that we've seen a big increase in full-time equivalent staff in the NHS. But at the same time, activity in the NHS in some areas has gone backwards and in other areas has only marginally increased. And really does raise a big question of what exactly has been going on in the NHS that we've employed so many more people to work there, and yet we aren't managing to increase activity. And so really understanding, I think the NHS is probably the most extreme case of many public services, but important to understand really what is going on in different services. So to look then at the ONS data, so as Stephen said, measuring public service productivity is inherently extremely difficult to do. We don't observe prices for most things. It's hard to define outputs for some things or to measure them. It's difficult to quality adjust the outputs that we do observe. I think there's a range of difficulties, and as Stephen said, the ONS is really very much at the forefront internationally of trying to properly measure productivity in the public sector, so moving away from simply assuming that inputs equals outputs to trying to get a better handle on what do we really produce with our inputs into public services. We do that, we've gone quite a long way in that in areas like healthcare, where most of healthcare is now measured in terms of trying to get a quality adjusted measure of output relative to the inputs going in as a measure of productivity. Other areas are still using inputs equals outputs, and there are areas where it's very difficult conceptually to think, how do we think about productivity? So for example, defence, where the ONS are now doing work with the MOD to try and start thinking about conceptualising how do we measure the productivity of defence, a service that is really mostly about prevention, and it's a very collective service. How do we value what people get out of defence? There are lots of really thorny methodological questions. I know we've got Grant Finstner from the ONS in the audience here, so I'm sure he'd be happy to answer the thorny questions on this subject, but just to say this is not an easy task. The sort of pattern over time that we've seen was broadly flat-ish, although I'll come back in a second to sort of distinguish two periods of time over this longer run. Then, as Stephen said, falling dramatically during the pandemic for reasons we probably all understand. At the moment, our sort of most comprehensive, robust, quality-adjusted measures of public service productivity are published with quite a lag. So we only currently have full year data for those measures up to 2020 at the moment. We have quarterly data that's much more current, but they're just output measures, not full quality adjustment, because of the delays in getting the full data required to do the full quality adjustment exercise. But the ONS has been trying to do some modelling approaches to try and get some more up-to-date data, obviously to help policymakers to understand what's been going on more recently. They have started publishing these, and some came out a month or so ago. I just thought I would say one thing to just sort of highlight some of the challenges around getting these more contemporaneous measures of public sector productivity. This purple line here shows the answer that you get if you essentially take the quarterly non-quality adjusted numbers and aggregate those up into the overall number, and they suggest that productivity was still quite far below its pre-pandemic level in the most recent 2 years. The ONS has done some regression-based analysis to essentially try and sort of use the relationship between those quarterly data and the full quality adjusted series in the historic data to then impute what's going on in the more recent period. And that suggests a stronger bounce back in productivity over the last couple of years. I think this is still work in progress. I think we have some reservations about whether that's telling us quite the right picture at the moment. In particular, the healthcare series for this period suggests that healthcare productivity has essentially rebounded back to its pre-pandemic level, and that doesn't seem consistent with the more granular data that you see, which I showed you in the previous chart on staffing and output levels. So I think there's an ongoing challenge there of trying to get more up-to-date, high-quality productivity stats for the public sector. So I said there were two periods that I would sort of distinguish here. The first is the 2000s period up to the financial crisis, where productivity, as measured by the ONS, is falling somewhat. And then through the 2010s, you find productivity growing somewhat. I'm highlighting these two because they're obviously very different periods in terms of the growth of public spending on public services over this period. And just to show you the sort of components there, these are the inputs and outputs series in the ONS data. And so during the 2000s, spending inputs were growing very rapidly, outputs were also growing quite rapidly, but not quite as rapidly. And that's showing up in a decline in productivity in those services. And then through the 2010s, as Stephen said, in an era when we were either cutting spending on some areas or not increasing it as rapidly as had happened in the past, that shows up in growing productivity in those services. To throw out a few thoughts, I think I'm partly with Stephen in thinking some of this is probably a real increase in productivity. If you squeeze the amount of money that a service is getting, that does seem likely to drive behaviours of trying to find better ways of doing things with what you have, rather than during a period of very rapidly rising budgets. I think we're slightly nervous that this may be overstating the productivity improvements that genuinely occurred during the 2010s in a lot of services. I just thought I'd show you a few figures from our performance tracker work, which Stephen referred to, sort of highlight why we're a bit concerned that maybe those numbers are not telling the whole story, or perhaps overstating how much of that productivity improvement was actually sustainable during that period. So firstly, hospital performance. 3 different measures here of different targets that the NHS tries to achieve. So the A&E 4-hour waiting target, so percentage of patients seen within 4 hours in A&E, the percentage of patients who received elective treatment within 18 weeks of a referral, and the percentage of patients who got cancer treatment within the specified time. All of these were meeting the targets in the early 2010s, and there were several years, even when spending restraints started to come in, where performance held up. But then you can quite clearly see from sort of 2013 onwards a decline in performance against all of these targets in the NHS. Similarly, if we look at prisons, what I'll show you here is the number of assaults of different types in prisons, both prisoner on prisoner and prisoner on staff assaults. So firstly, looking at assaults on prisoners, unfortunately there's a methodological change in 2018 when they stopped including data on assaults in the youth prison estate, so that's why those numbers aren't quite comparable pre and post 2018. But again, there seems to be a pattern here of sort of a few years where assaults stayed at roughly the same level they had been in 2010, but then starting to grow quite rapidly from 2014 onwards as spending cuts started to bite more severely. It's quite a complicated picture what happens after that. So there were some changes in behaviours in prisons in 2018. So that partly changes in how they manage prisoners, which partly explain why you start to see a decline in assaults pre-pandemic. There was then a very sharp fall in assaults during the pandemic, simply as a result of all prisoners being locked in their cells, which meant they couldn't actually come into contact with each other. But since then, there's started to be a growing rate of assaults in prisons again. And you see a broadly similar picture for assaults on staff, and then the most serious category of assaults, where there does seem to be a growing, I guess, in a sense, declining quality of prisons in recent years as spending cuts have continued. So those are two sets of services where we worry that some of the indicators suggest that actually some of those spending cuts that may have driven early productivity improvements may not have been completely sustainable. The second thing, which I don't have a chart for, relates to capital spending. So during the 2010s, capital spending was cut back much more sharply than current spending was. Although that started to reverse in more recent years, for lots of the major public services, capital spending is still below where it was in 2010 in real terms. And I guess there's a sort of difficult conceptual question about when you measure capital spending and when you start to pick up the impacts of a lack of capital spending. And our work on the NHS certainly, and on other services, suggests that a lack of capital investment is starting to drag on performance of current services. So you've probably seen in the news stories of sewage leaks in hospitals closing down wards, or operating theatres not operating because there's a leak through the roof and that sort of thing. Similarly, in prisons, the estate is at such capacity that it's quite hard. The conditions are not great, and it's quite hard in some prisons to even do the maintenance work because they're at such excess capacity that they can't actually move prisoners out of the cells to do the work to improve the conditions that they're living in. So we have some concerns that the lack of capital investment takes a long time to show up in the performance of services, and so can flatter the apparent productivity of those services for some time before you then really see the negative impacts of that. However, what can be done to improve productivity? So I think Stephen is right. We should sort of think forward and think about what we can improve. Our work through Performance Tracker and some of the other projects that we've done relating to public service performance highlight some common issues across a lot of services that might point to areas that you could look to for productivity improvements. One of those is capital. So as I said, maintenance problems in services are dragging on productivity performance, so that could be an option there. Stephen mentioned IT. Our work suggests that we could improve productivity through IT advances, not through doing anything radical. We're not talking about huge adoption of AI across the sector to do whizzy new things, but literally having computers in hospitals that don't take 15 minutes to boot up, that don't run Windows XP, that's no longer supported by anyone. Really quite simple IT improvements that could have a benefit. Our work also highlights some systemic workforce issues, partly as a result of the kind of bust-boom cycle of spending in a lot of services. There's been a lot of loss of experienced staff in many services. So while we've started recruiting more people, for example, 20,000 new police officers, it actually takes a while for those people to become fully effective. And for a time, they can actually be a drain on existing staff because they need to be trained up. So one feature is sort of retaining and experienced staff within the service and thinking strategically about the workforce you need, rather than doing a round of voluntary redundancies and getting rid of all your experienced staff and then deciding 2 years later that actually you need a lot of those people back. Some other areas that our work points to, one would be more stable, longer-term funding settlements to allow services to plan more efficiently for the money that they're going to be spending. We saw a series of one-year spending reviews. We did have a 3-year one in 2021, but there's been a lot of uncertainty created by the election and not really being able to see what's happening beyond that. So hopefully after the next election, we can move to a cycle of more stable, longer-term settlements. The same is true probably on steroids for capital spending, where obviously decision-making timelines are longer. Would also be helped by stability in policy making. We have had churn in objectives with governments. We've had a lot of change of ministers in some areas, and that creates uncertainty about what services are really trying to achieve, or sort of successive changes in policy initiatives being pushed through services. It would be great to have more of a focus on outcomes rather than inputs and outputs. The outcome delivery plan framework, which some of you may be familiar with, is a great step in the right direction, but we still have had quite a lot of initiatives in recent years for 20,000 extra police officers, very much sort of input measure focused. And totally agree with Stephen on the sort of the bigger prize of allocative efficiency, shifting resources away from dealing with the acute end of the problems to more preventative work. It's something we're doing some more work on here at the IFG at the moment. But as Stephen said, many challenges there about how you deal with the double funding that is inherently required when you make that shift.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And some very striking figures there. So really useful to see. Right, let us open the floor to have a discussion about this. And we've got a fabulous audience here. Could you each introduce yourselves and the organisation you're with, if relevant?
I'm Jeff Crocker. I work as an industry strategy consultant. Stephen, you made a very good point about the need to have more entrepreneurial and more incentivised management, both in local government and in central government. But is it really possible to change the culture, which is so subject to daily operational political control, and really release managerial talent? If you bring it to a specific issue that we face currently, that's of the planning system, which I think, as we all know, is facing significant sclerosis. And where I live, they're currently quoting 24 weeks to decide on every planning application. What's caused that lack of productivity, and how are we going to deal with it? Because the ongoing effect of it on projects not being delivered in the private sector is currently huge.
That's a very specific question there, thank you. Shall we take two or three questions and then answer them together?
Yes, hello. So my name is Felix, I'm from the Office for Budget Responsibility. I should ask about cash pool benefits. I wanted to ask, probably again for Stephen though, about to what extent is this something that can be solved centrally? And at what level do you best align incentives, information and resources if you want good decision making on what to do and oversight and accountability on how best to do it?
Thank you. I imagine Gemma may well have good, wise words on that as well. And I'm not sure who was, I think you were first. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Leon. I'm working at DHSC. I have two questions, but you guys can decide which ones you'd like to respond to. The first one is in regards to the stuff about prisons and hospitals. This might be a silly question, but have we tried asking the people that work there what they feel the best way to improve productivity is? And how often does that align with what we prescribe through analysis? And then the second question is, well, recently we've had a push in civil service against remote work because of productivity concerns. But on the flip side, I think remote work has also helped us employ people outside of London who, we might be drawing on people who potentially have a lot of skills and less opportunities. I was wondering whether you think that this, I don't know, which side of this trade-off dominates in that effect? Is it better to have more in-person work concentrated in London, or remote work that's sort of spread across the UK?
Thank you. So there we have a specific question and a rather broader question, and a very interesting one. I think we'll pause there and then come back and perhaps turn first to Stephen, as you were somewhat targeted in this.
No, that's all right. No, they're excellent questions. Your question, can the public sector, public services be more entrepreneurial? Personally, I think the answer to that is yes, but it's not just about giving people more entrepreneurial freedom. It's got to come with the right sorts of accountabilities. Yeah? That might be to users of the services or others, or it might be better transparency about performance. I think culture can be changed. I mean, in terms of areas I'm most familiar with, when I look at, for example, how we've managed to shift focus, for example, through programs like the Troubled Families Programme or the Supporting Families Programme, to earlier and more joined up interventions, which have been very effective at reducing numbers of children going into care. That has involved culture change. It's meant different service providers have to work together and are incentivised to do so by the programme. And as we've built our evidence base on the effectiveness of different homelessness interventions, I think, again, we've enabled both a more entrepreneurial and more effective response. I totally take your point about the planning system. I don't have an answer to that, but I can't see why, in principle, one couldn't imagine similar sort of changes in that area. Question: can everything be solved centrally? Probably not. I think you do need to enable different providers of services, whether centrally or locally, to have freedom to work out what is the most appropriate way of meeting the needs or tackling the problems they're tasked with. But alongside that freedom, I think, must come the right accountabilities and incentives and transparency. So you've got to decentralise, but at the same time, you've got to have the performance mechanisms, means to hold to account those people you're empowering with new freedoms. Your point about should we ask the workforce for their views? Absolutely. I mean, I just think in my own team, they have lots of views on ways in which things could be done differently and more productively, and I'm sure that's true of others here. On remote working, I mean, my view is, I'd like to think we could be guided by the evidence. Much of course depends on who you are. I think of many of my newer recruits, less experienced members of my team. It's very important that they're in the office learning from their colleagues. They can't do it all on Teams. So I think we need to be pragmatic and guided by the evidence.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Gemma.
Great. Just to briefly add on the question about devolution, can this all be solved centrally? I mean, we would also agree that there's lots of potential for devolving responsibilities. I guess our work suggests that one big potential benefit is being able to join up different services in an area to try and achieve more with the same amount by connecting things. So individuals they have lots of things that they need from the state, and sometimes there are ways of doing those more effectively together at a joined up area in a local area. We think it's quite important that that's at the right level. So lots of our sort of local government tier is really too small to effectively deliver a lot of policies. We're quite unusual across the world in having such a small level of local government. So the mayoral combined authorities are probably a more appropriate tier of government to be doing that, but obviously some parts of the country don't have those. On Leon's questions, so firstly, asking people, yes, absolutely. I should have said, although I'm doing a lot of data presentation here, our work, our performance tracker work and all our other projects, we do also go out and talk to people who work in these services to understand what's actually going on and to try and, the data can give you a lot and it can help you sense check some of the things that you're hearing from people, but yes, also very important to actually talk to people to make sure you're getting the right understanding out of the data. Also on talking to people, just to flag a couple of other developments that the ONS are working on related to this. One is a time use survey in the public sector. So I think initial results of that are coming out next month, I think. So to understand how do people actually use their time and is that time well spent? And also a management survey, so extending the existing management and expectations survey of the private sector, which already exists, and rolling out an equivalent one for public sector to understand what's actually going on in terms of management practices. On your question about remote work, I I guess one thing is that making use of people outside London doesn't necessarily require remote working. We do have and can develop government offices outside London as well. One thing we have highlighted in our recent performance tracker is that remote work is becoming more of a reality in the private sector. Lots of businesses, for lots of reasons, are allowing their staff to work flexibly in that way. And if the public sector wants to compete for talent, there are obviously some jobs in the public sector that you can't do aspects of them remotely, but to the extent that it is possible for the public sector to offer flexibility to staff, we think it's something that the public sector should consider, because otherwise you're essentially going to have to offer higher compensation through the rest of the package to encourage people to not take a flexible job.
Can I just pick up on one thing?
Yes, but I'm conscious time has gone rather quickly and we still have a few people who want to ask questions. So do you want to pick that up in your next response? Yeah. Martin's definitely first here.
Martin Wheel from King's College London and the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence. The discussion so far has been entirely about Britain. I wondered whether, for example, with the health service, where in France more is spent on it, there are grumbles, but I don't think the grumbles have the sort of volume that we hear about the NHS. Are you looking at how other countries organise their public services with a view to seeing what can be gained from that? The second thing was more an observation on the issue of prevention. I have done some work on measurement of public sector output, and the issue of where you draw the boundary, what counts as a health intervention and what doesn't, is bound to affect the results. So, for example, the building of the sewerage system has been a very important factor in improving health outcomes, but we don't expect to show that up in the statistics on health output. Thank you.
Excellent points. Let's move on then to Grant.
Grant Fitzton, Chief Economist, ONS. Interesting discussion, and of course we're in the middle of the Public Services Productivity Review, hoping to get an extension into next financial year and make further progress on this. But it's fair to say that the low-hanging fruit in the way of health and education are kind of largely dealt with. We're dealing with more methodologically complex areas, including preventative services such as policing and defence, and how do you capture those outputs when actually it's the absence of something such as crime or military attack that you're trying to measure. And for those interested in update, sorry, quick plug, we published a progress update on the ONS website yesterday. But my question to the members of the panel is, imagine that, a bit of a thought experiment, imagine you're a public services productivity czar for the day, and you can make one big decision that you think will move the dial. What would it be?
Interesting. Right, I think we have Vicky Price next, and then Deanne, and then that is going to need to be it.
Thank you. Yes.
In fact, we're very tight on time.
Indeed. Well, I'll
quick
say it quickly. Obviously, the statistics that we've seen suggest that we just don't know what is going on, frankly, from all the stuff. So we can't measure it. But what
you two are in the wrong order.
But what we can see is the waste in terms of some of the capital spending, because we don't have proper managers to be on top of it. And Deanne, who's coming after me, of course, did a review of procurement capabilities in the civil service, and all sorts of suggestions were made. I mean, look at the Horizon, look at HS2 now, where the suggestions obviously have not been followed, and we still don't have those managers. So the waste that's happening there surely is much more measurable, because we basically are not on top of all those projects. So isn't that a much more useful way of focusing attention? That's what you need, the skills. I think it was mentioned by Stephen. And then finally, on the measurement side, there are differences across, thinking of what Martin asked, in terms of the way in which public sector productivity is measured in different countries. So it's actually quite difficult to compare across.
Thank you. On to Deanne.
Thank you. Yes, I guess I'm drawing from an old work that I used to do on public sector outsourcing. But it did surprise me that you didn't mention contestability as one of the areas where we can really improve productivity. It's not possible in every subsector of the public sector, but where it is possible, there is evidence that that does improve things. And of course, it also reduces the need for what you call accountability, which
Exactly.
leads to a huge amount of risk aversion
Yes.
by managers in the public sector.
Yes.
A couple of quick points. It'd be interesting if one of your organizations or those here did some work on strikes and how they affected public sector and overall productivity, particularly the railway strikes, which affected so many sectors. And I haven't even seen an estimate of what it did to GDP, what proportion of the GDP growth aspect was actually attributable to strikes in the public sector elsewhere. And finally, Martin's view about looking at a comparative view across countries caused me to think about Denmark and Switzerland, who happen to be two countries I know a little bit about for personal reasons. Some big differences there, of course they're huge differences. One is they both have the equivalent of a national identity number or card. And when it comes to improving data, that is a huge help, and it's also a huge help in interdepartmental cooperation because people have the same data on the prisoner, the patient, the criminal. And I think the second thing that they do is very much contestability in that public sector services are paid for by the government, by tax revenue, but they're often delivered by the private sector. And that's true of railways, many, many different services, education.
Thank you. And one more question.
Excellent question.
Do feel free to leave at
Excellent.
10 o'clock if you need to, but we can stay on here a few more minutes.
I'll try to keep mine very brief. I'm Sian from the TUC, and so endorse the question about workforce and talking to workers. But I had a broader question around productivity gains. And Gemma, I would agree with you that actually what we saw was in the early 2010s, just after, was the productivity gains of that increased spending, particularly around the new labour investment in preventative services. And then what we're seeing now are the productivity losses of those cuts post-2010. And I was interested in some of the measures you used there, but also in this colleague here's comment around absence, because actually what you can see now are higher rates of recidivism, higher rates of children being taken into care, declining life expectancy, rising rates of homelessness. And they're not captured within some of these graphs, but they, for me, point to the absence of them early on in the 2010 and then the stark rise in them point to some of the impacts of the productivity losses I would consider that have arisen out of austerity measures. And I suppose my question is therefore, are we taking into account within productivity measures those wider metrics? Because they certainly are, for me, some of the outcomes of decision making around public spending. But crucially, given that we think there is a lag between productivity gain and productivity losses, how, when public spending is so political, can we frame this conversation in a way that encourages long-term decision-making over public spending? Because arguably it's going to be a different government potentially picking up all the problems caused by an earlier government, and likewise it was a different government that picked up some of the productivity gains of an earlier government's decisions on public spending. Thank you.
Thank you. A very excellent closing question. I suggest I turn to Gemma first, if that's okay.
So on how the UK compares, we haven't done work on that, but I agree it's a very interesting question. I think it's actually one question that ONS is slightly grappling with in designing the management survey for the public sector because, for example, Nick Bloom and others have their World Management Survey and they have a tailored version of that for healthcare and education, which has been rolled out in other countries. So one could field similar questions in the new ONS management survey in the UK, which would probably facilitate some understanding, at least in terms of the role of management practices in productivity, comparing those different services. As you say, I think someone else said, there are lots of differences in what we observe in different countries, but if you could ask similar types of questions of different services, it might give you more scope for comparability. But there's obviously a trade-off between that and retaining comparability between different services in the UK in the ONS data and between the public and private sector in the UK in the ONS data. Grant, your question, what one big thing would I do? Gosh, that's a very unfair question. I was trying to scan through my list. I mean, it is a very fair question, but I think if I was to pick one, and this is my answer, not an official IFG answer on this, I'd probably focus on improving leadership and management, because I think from that sort of capacity, a lot of other things could potentially flow, whether it's better management of your workforce, better use and planning of capital spending, that sort of thing. Vicky, your question was partly about measurement across different countries as well, so I think I've answered that. Deanne's question on strikes. We have looked a little bit at this, about the impact on strikes in healthcare. I mean, there are numbers available on the number of lost days, and so it is quite significant. And our takeaway is that government could have managed the strikes better, in terms that it took a long time to engage seriously, and we could probably have had less loss of goodwill with a slightly different approach to managing the strikes. It would be lovely to be Denmark and Switzerland with matching ID numbers. I think the MOJ have done a great job with their new bold data initiative of trying to link up data in justice. 'Cause it's not just that we don't know who someone is in the justice system and who someone is in the health system, but we don't even know that it's the same person in a court case that then shows up in prison, that then shows up in the probation system later on. So lots of challenges in doing that here. Sean, your question on productivity gains. I think the thing your question really highlights is the measurement challenge here. It's like, what do we measure as outputs and quality of service? Because we tend to take these kind of annual snapshots looking at these things, but some effects are quite delayed. As you say, recidivism, children being taken into care can have quite a long tail effect of services. So I think it does get back to the real the challenge of just measuring these things.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Over to Stephen.
Fantastic questions. This is not the time to do them justice, but a few things. We're probably not as good as we ought to be at making international comparisons. That's certainly true, I think. And though it's hard because of, there's just the lack of consistent comparable measures across countries. But nonetheless, you can draw some interesting conclusions. So on planning, one thing that's interesting if you look at the UK is how different our planning system is from other countries. So we devolve decision making to the lowest tier of local government, and then secondly we have a system of case-by-case approval. And then we wonder why decisions take so long to be taken. In France, by contrast, and other countries, they have zoning arrangements, and provided you can adhere with the plan within that zone, you can get on and build. So you can do comparisons which help to explain the performance of different countries. A more positive example, though people tend not to believe it, but I think it's true, is we've become, I think we're very good at this country in using evidence-based interventions to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. And if you look at our rough sleeping numbers compared with most other developed countries, they compare extremely well. I think one piece of work I saw suggested that I think it was only South Korea had fewer rough sleepers per capita than the UK. Not widely appreciated, but I think partly a testament to the evidence base that is behind the interventions we use, and that reflects some years of good investment in policy and programme evaluation. So my one wish, to answer Grant's question, would be let's have more better quality, robust evidence on what works. In some areas, and I would, in my own department's case, I'd cite what we've done on homelessness and rough sleeping. That has made a big difference. We could do so much more in other areas of policy where we really don't know as much as we should do about what works and what doesn't. I totally agree on the point about contestability. Of course, you could do that within the public sector as well as opening up to private and civil society. And in fact, in many public services, of course, civil society does play a much bigger role than is often appreciated, those sector providers might benefit from better evidence on what works as well. And then totally agree too on data. mean, one of Gemma mentioned Project Bold, which is indeed a fantastic project, but it does not obviate the need for my team, because we're partners with MOG on this, to put in place all sorts of legal gateways to enable us to access and link data. And across public services, incredible amounts of quality data exist, but you immediately come up against these issues of, before you can access it, you need to make sure you've got a legal gateway. And resolving that can take literally years. For our Troubled Families evaluation, it took us 2 years to get the necessary legal gateways in place to access data held by other departments. And we totally failed to access health data. We got other departments' data. So one shouldn't underestimate the challenges of accessing and linking data across departments, or indeed between different tiers of government, because on Project Bold, each local authority will want to assure itself that they have a legal gateway to share data with us, which we can then combine with other departments' data. So there's huge potential there, but the barriers can be significant. But look, we haven't got enough time really to address all these things.
Thank you both very much indeed, and also thanks to the excellent engagement and questions from the audience. 1 hour was always going to be tight, and it has absolutely proved to be that. We've had a really interesting discussion about how you measure things, the issues with the measurement, and in particular, your point about delays is something that really needs to be in our mind and is a feature in any evaluation, but is a constraint on looking at the pure data, all the way through to what to do about it, with an understandable focus on getting the evidence base right and the analysis right, which you would expect from this audience, but I would like to think has a much wider read across. We should bear in mind that a lot of these recommendations have been tried for some time within government. There is a much bigger focus on user feedback. I well remember Tony Blair initiating his big move to feedback on your NHS. And equally, there are constant pushes to digitalise more, etc. So these are not easy, but the more evidence we have, the more we free up and the more we relax the constraints. And perhaps also look at the balance between risk and spending rather than stamping on anything which is a risk. So there are a huge range of issues raised here. It's extremely interesting, and I have certainly learned a lot from participating in this conversation. So thank the audience, and thank you both very much indeed.
Great stuff.